Reason-free, Greece and Rome. When we are asked to specify the debt which civilization owes to the Greeks, their achievements in literature and art naturally occur to us first of all. But a truer answer may be that our deepest gratitude is due to them as the originators of liberty of thought and discussion. For this freedom of spirit was not only the condition of their speculations in philosophy, their progress in science, their experiments in political institutions, it was also a condition of their literary and artistic excellence. Their literature, for instance, could not have been what it is if they had been debarred from free criticism of life. But apart from what they actually accomplished, even if they had not achieved the wonderful things they did in most of the realms of human activity, their assertion of the principle of liberty would place them in the highest rank among the benefactors of the race, for it was one of the greatest steps in human progress. We do not know enough about the earliest history of the Greeks to explain how it was that they attained their free outlook upon the world and came to possess the will and courage to set no bounds to the range of their criticism and curiosity. We have to take this character as a fact. But it must be remembered that the Greeks consisted of a large number of separate peoples, who varied largely in temper, customs, and traditions, though they had important features common to all. Some were conservative, or backward, or unintellectual compared with others. In this chapter, the Greeks does not mean all the Greeks, but only those who count most in the history of civilization, especially the Ionians and Athenians. Ionia in Asia Minor was the cradle of free speculation. The history of European science and European philosophy begins in Ionia. Here, in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, the early philosophers, by using their reason, sought to penetrate into the origin and structure of the world. They could not, of course, free their minds entirely from received notions, but they began the work of destroying orthodox views and religious faiths. Xenophanes may specially be named among these pioneers of thought, though he was not the most important or the ablest, because the toleration of his teaching illustrates the freedom of the atmosphere in which these men lived. He went about from city to city, calling in question on moral grounds the popular beliefs about the gods and goddesses, and ridiculing the anthropomorphic conceptions which the Greeks had formed of their divinities. If oxen had hands and the capacities of men, they would make gods in the shape of oxen. This attack on received theology was an attack on the veracity of the old poets, especially Homer, who was considered the highest authority on mythology. Xenophanes criticized him severely for ascribing to the gods acts which, committed by men, would be considered highly disgraceful. We do not hear that any attempt was made to restrain him from thus assailing traditional beliefs and branding Homer as immoral. We must remember that the Homeric poems were never supposed to be the word of God. It has been said that Homer was the Bible of the Greeks. The remark exactly misses the truth. The Greeks, fortunately, had no Bible, and this fact was both an expression and an important condition of their freedom. Homer's poems were secular, not religious, and it may be noted that they are freer from immorality and savagery than sacred books that one could mention. Their authority was immense, but it was not binding like the authority of a sacred book, and so Homeric criticism was never hampered like biblical criticism. In this connection, notice may be taken of another expression and condition of freedom, the absence of sacerdotalism. The priests of the temples never became powerful castes, tyrannizing over the community in their own interests and able to silence voices raised against religious beliefs. The civil authorities kept the general control of public worship in their own hands, and if some priestly families might have considerable influence, yet as a rule the priests were virtually state servants, whose voice carried no weight except concerning the technical details of ritual. To return to the early philosophers, who were mostly materialists, the record of their speculations is an interesting chapter in the history of rationalism. Two great names may be selected, Heraclitus and Democritus, because they did more perhaps than any of the others by sheer hard thinking, to train reason to look upon the universe in new ways, and to shock the unreasoned conceptions of common sense. It was startling to be taught for the first time by Heraclitus that the appearance of stability and permanence which material things present to our senses is a false appearance, and that the world and everything in it are changing every instant. Democritus performed the amazing feat of working out an atomic theory of the universe, which was revived in the 17th century and is connected in the history of speculation with the most modern physical and chemical theories of matter. No fantastic tales of creation imposed by sacred authority hampered these powerful brains. All this philosophical speculation prepared the way for the educationalists, who were known as the Sophists. They began to appear after the middle of the 5th century. They worked here and there throughout Greece, constantly traveling, training young men for public life, and teaching them to use their reason. As educators, they had practical ends in view. They turned away from the problems of the physical universe to the problems of human life, morality and polities. Here they were confronted with the difficulty of distinguishing between truth and error, and the ablest of them investigated the nature of knowledge, the method of reason, logic, and the instrument of reason, speech. Whatever their particular theories might be, their general spirit was that of free inquiry and discussion. They sought to test everything by reason. The second half of the 5th century might be called the Age of Illumination. It may be remarked that the knowledge of foreign countries which the Greeks had acquired had a considerable effect in promoting a skeptical attitude towards authority. When a man is acquainted only with the habits of his own country, they seem so much a matter of course that he ascribes them to nature. But when he travels abroad and finds totally different habits and standards of conduct prevailing, he begins to understand the power of custom, and learns that morality and religion are matters of latitude. This discovery tends to weaken authority and to raise disquieting reflections, as in the case of one who, brought up as a Christian, comes to realize that if he had been born on the Ganges or the Euphrates, he would have firmly believed in entirely different dogmas. Of course, these movements of intellectual freedom were, as in all ages, confined to the minority. Everywhere the masses were exceedingly superstitious. They believed that the safety of their cities depended on the goodwill of their gods. If this superstitious spirit were alarmed, there was always a danger that philosophical speculations might be persecuted. And this occurred in Athens. About the middle of the 5th century, Athens had not only become the most powerful state in Greece, but was also taking the highest place in literature and art. She was a full-fledged democracy. Political discussion was perfectly free. At this time she was guided by the statesman Pericles, who was personally a freethinker, or at least was in touch with all the subversive speculations of the day. He was especially intimate with the philosopher Anaxagoras, who had come from Ionia to teach at Athens. In regard to the popular gods, Anaxagoras was a thoroughgoing unbeliever. The political enemies of Pericles struck at him by attacking his friend. They introduced and carried a blasphemy law, to the effect that unbelievers and those who taught theories about the celestial world might be impeached. It was easy to prove that Anaxagoras was a blasphemer who taught that the gods were abstractions and that the sun, to which the ordinary Athenian said prayers morning and evening, was a mass of flaming matter. The influence of Pericles saved him from death. He was heavily fined and left Athens for Lampsacus, where he was treated with consideration and honor. Other cases are recorded which show that anti-religious thought was liable to be persecuted. Protagoras, one of the greatest of the sophists, published a book on the gods, the object of which seems to have been to prove that one cannot know the gods by reason. The first words ran, "Concerning the gods, I cannot say that they exist, nor yet that they do not exist. There are more reasons than one why we cannot know. There is the obscurity of the subject, and there is the brevity of human life." A charge of blasphemy was lodged against him, and he fled from Athens, but there was no systematic policy of suppressing free thought. Copies of the work of Protagoras were collected and burned, but the book of Anaxagoras, setting forth the views for which he had been condemned, was for sale on the Athenian bookstalls at a popular price. Rationalistic ideas, moreover, were venturing to appear on the stage, though the dramatic performances at the feasts of the god Dionysius were religious solemnities. The poet Euripides was saturated with modern speculation, and while different opinions may be held as to the tendencies of some of his tragedies, he often allows his characters to express highly unorthodox views. He was prosecuted for impiety by a popular politician. We may suspect that during the last 30 years of the 5th century, unorthodoxy spread considerably among the educated classes. There was a large enough section of influential rationalists to render impossible any organized repression of liberty, and the chief evil of the blasphemy law was that it could be used for personal or party reasons. Some of the prosecutions about which we know were certainly due to such motives. Others may have been prompted by genuine bigotry and by the fear lest skeptical thought should extend beyond the highly educated and leisured class. It was a generally accepted principle among the Greeks, and afterwards among the Romans, that religion was a good and necessary thing for the common people. Men who did not believe in its truth believed in its usefulness as a political institution, and as a rule philosophers did not seek to diffuse disturbing truth among the masses. It was the custom, much more than at the present day, for those who did not believe in the established cults to conform to them externally. Popular higher education was not an article in the program of Greek statesmen or thinkers, and perhaps it may be argued that in the circumstances of the ancient world it would have hardly been practicable. There was, however, one illustrious Athenian who thought differently, Socrates, the philosopher. Socrates was the greatest of the educationalists, but unlike the others he taught gratuitously, though he was a poor man. His teaching always took the form of discussion. The discussion often ended in no positive result, but had the effect of showing that some received opinion was untenable and that truth is difficult to ascertain. He had indeed certain definite views about knowledge and virtue, which are of the highest importance in the history of philosophy, but for our present purpose his significance lies in his enthusiasm for discussion and criticism. He taught those with whom he conversed, and he conversed indiscriminately with all who would listen to him, to bring all popular beliefs before the bar of reason, to approach every inquiry with an open mind, and not to judge by the opinion of majorities or the dictate of authority. In short, to seek for other tests of the truth of an opinion than the fact that it is held by a great many people. Among his disciples were all the young men who were to become the leading philosophers of the next generation, and some who played prominent parts in Athenian history. If the Athenians had had a daily press, Socrates would have been denounced by the journalists as a dangerous person. They had a comic drama which constantly held up to ridicule philosophers and sophists and their vain doctrines. We possess one play, The Clouds of Aristophanes, in which Socrates is pilloried as a typical representative of impious and destructive speculations. Apart from annoyances of this kind, Socrates reached old age pursuing the task of instructing his fellow citizens without any evil befalling him. Then at the age of 70 he was prosecuted as an atheist and corrupter of youth and was put to death. 399 BC. It is strange that if the Athenians really thought him dangerous, they should have suffered him so long. There can, I think, be little doubt that the motives of the accusation were political. Socrates, looking at things as he did, could not be sympathetic with unlimited democracy, or approve of the principle that the will of the ignorant majority was a good guide. He was probably known to sympathize with those who wished to limit the franchise. When, after a struggle in which the Constitution had been more than once overthrown, democracy emerged triumphant, 403 BC, there was a bitter feeling against those who had not been its friends, and of these disloyal persons Socrates was chosen as a victim. If he had wished, he could easily have escaped. If he had given an undertaking to teach no more, he would almost certainly have been acquitted. As it was, of the 501 ordinary Athenians who were his judges, a very large minority voted for his acquittal. Even then, if he had adopted a different tone, he would not have been condemned to death. He rose to the great occasion and vindicated freedom of discussion in a wonderful unconventional speech. The Apology of Socrates, which was composed by his most brilliant pupil, Plato, the philosopher, reproduces the general tenor of his defense. It is clear that he was not able to meet satisfactorily the charge that he did not acknowledge the gods worshipped by the city, and his explanations on this point are the weak part of his speech. But he met the accusation that he corrupted the minds of the young by a splendid plea for free discussion. This is the most valuable section of the Apology. It is as impressive today as ever. I think the two principal points which he makes are these. 1. He maintains that the individual should at any cost refuse to be coerced by any human authority or tribunal into a course which his own mind condemns as wrong. That is, he asserts the supremacy of the individual conscience, as we should say, over human law. He represents his own life work as a sort of religious quest. He feels convinced that in devoting himself to philosophical discussion, he has done the bidding of a superhuman guide, and he goes to death rather than be untrue to this personal conviction. If you propose to acquit me, he says, on condition that I abandon my search for truth, I will say, I thank you, O Athenians, but I will obey God, who, as I believe, set me this task rather than you, and so long as I have breath and strength, I will never cease from my occupation with philosophy. I will continue the practice of accosting whomever I meet, and saying to him, Are you not ashamed of setting your heart on wealth and honors, while you have no care for wisdom and truth, and making your soul better? I know not what death is. It may be a good thing, and I am not afraid of it. but I do know that it is a bad thing to desert one's post, and I prefer what may be good to what I know to be bad. 2. He insists on the public value of free discussion. In me you have a stimulating critic, persistently urging you with persuasion and reproaches, persistently testing your opinions and trying to show you that you are really ignorant of what you suppose you know. Daily discussion of the matters about which you hear me conversing is the highest good for man. Life that is not tested by such discussion is not worth living. Thus, in what we may call the earliest justification of liberty of thought, we have two significant claims affirmed. The indefeasible right of the conscience of the individual, a claim on which later struggles for liberty were to turn, and the social importance of discussion and criticism. The former claim is not based on argument but on intuition. It rests, in fact, on the assumption of some sort of superhuman moral principle, and to those who, not having the same personal experience as Socrates, reject this assumption, his pleading does not carry weight. The second claim, after the experience of more than 2,000 years, can be formulated more comprehensively now with bearings of which he did not dream. The circumstances of the trial of Socrates illustrate both the tolerance and the intolerance which prevailed at Athens. His long immunity, the fact that he was at last indicted from political motives, and perhaps personal also, the large minority in his favor, all show that thought was normally free, and that the massive intolerance which existed was only fitfully invoked, and perhaps most often to serve other purposes. I may mention the case of the philosopher Aristotle, who some 70 years later left Athens because he was menaced by a prosecution for blasphemy, the charge being a pretext for attacking one who belonged to a certain political party. The persecution of opinion was never organized. It may seem curious that to find the persecuting spirit in Greece we have to turn to the philosophers. Plato, the most brilliant disciple of Socrates, constructed in his later years an ideal state. In this state he instituted a religion considerably different from the current religion, and proposed to compel all citizens to believe in his gods on pain of death or imprisonment. All freedom of discussion was excluded under the cast-iron system which he conceived. But the point of interest in his attitude is that he did not care much whether a religion was true, but only whether it was morally useful. He was prepared to promote morality by edifying fables, and he condemned the popular mythology, not because it was false, but because it did not make for righteousness. The outcome of the large freedom permitted at Athens was a series of philosophies which had a common source in the conversations of Socrates. Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Skeptics, it may be maintained that the efforts of thought represented by these names have had a deeper influence on the progress of man than any other continuous intellectual movement, at least until the rise of modern science in a new epoch of liberty. The doctrines of the Epicureans, Stoics, and Skeptics all aimed at securing peace and guidance for the individual soul. They were widely propagated throughout the Greek world from the 3rd century BC, and we may say that from this time onward most well-educated Greeks were more or less rationalists. The teaching of Epicurus had a distinct anti-religious tendency. He considered fear to be the fundamental motive of religion, and to free men's minds from this fear was a principal object of his teaching. He was a materialist, explaining the world by the atomic theory of Democritus, and denying any divine government of the universe. He did indeed hold the existence of gods, but, so far as men are concerned, his gods are as if they were not, living in some remote abode and enjoying a sacred and everlasting calm. They just served as an example of the realization of the ideal Epicurean life. There was something in this philosophy which had the power to inspire a poet of singular genius to expound it in verse. The Roman Lucretius, 1st century BC, regarded Epicurus as the great deliverer of the human race and determined to proclaim the glad tidings of his philosophy in a poem on the nature of the world. With all the fervor of a religious enthusiast, he denounces religion, sounding every note of defiance, loathing, and contempt, and branding in burning words the crimes to which it had urged man on. He rides forth as a leader of the hosts of atheism against the walls of heaven. He explains the scientific arguments as if they were the radiant revelation of a new world, and the rapture of his enthusiasm is a strange accompaniment of a doctrine which aimed at perfect calm. Although the Greek thinkers had done all the work, and the Latin poem is a hymn of triumph over prostrate deities, yet in the literature of free thought it must always hold an eminent place by the sincerity of its audacious, defiant spirit. In the history of rationalism, its interest would be greater if it had exploded in the midst of an orthodox community. But the educated Romans in the days of Lucretius were skeptical in religious matters, some of them were Epicureans, and we may suspect that not many of those who read it were shocked or influenced by the audacities of the champion of irreligion. The Stoic philosophy made notable contributions to the cause of liberty and could hardly have flourished in an atmosphere where discussion was not free. It asserted the rights of individuals against public authority. Socrates had seen that laws may be unjust and that peoples may go wrong, but he had found no principle for the guidance of society. The Stoics discovered it in the law of nature, prior and superior to all the customs and written laws of peoples, and this doctrine, spreading outside Stoic circles, caught hold of the Roman world and affected Roman legislation. These philosophies have carried us from Greece to Rome. In the later Roman Republic and the early Empire, no restrictions were imposed on opinion, and these philosophies, which made the individual the first consideration, spread widely. Most of the leading men were unbelievers in the official religion of the state, but they considered it valuable for the purpose of keeping the uneducated populace in order. A Greek historian expresses high approval of the Roman policy of cultivating superstition for the benefit of the masses. This was the attitude of Cicero, and the view that a false religion is indispensable as a social machine was general among ancient unbelievers. It is common in one form or another today. At least religions are constantly defended on the ground not of truth, but of utility. This defense belongs to the statecraft of Machiavelli, who taught that religion is necessary for government, and that it may be the duty of a ruler to support a religion which he believes to be false. A word must be said of Lucian, 2nd century A.D., the last Greek man of letters whose writings appeal to everybody. He attacked the popular mythology with open ridicule. It is impossible to say whether his satires had any effect at the time beyond affording enjoyment to educated infidels who read them. Zeus in a tragedy part is one of the most effective. The situation which Lucian imagined here would be paralleled if a modern writer were blasphemously to represent the persons of the Trinity with some eminent angels and saints discussing in a celestial smoke-room the alarming growth of unbelief in England, and then, by means of a telephonic apparatus, overhearing a dispute between a freethinker and a parson on a public platform in London. The absurdities of anthropomorphism have never been the subject of more brilliant jesting than in Lucian's satires. The general rule of Roman policy was to tolerate throughout the empire all religions and all opinions. Blasphemy was not punished. The principle was expressed in the maxim of Emperor Tiberius: "If the gods are insulted, let them see to it themselves." An exception to the rule of tolerance was made in the case of the Christian sect, and the treatment of this Oriental religion may be said to have inaugurated religious persecution in Europe. It is a matter of interest to understand why emperors, who were able, humane, and not in the least fanatical, adopted this exceptional policy. For a long time, the Christians were only known to those Romans who happened to hear of them as a sect of the Jews. The Jewish was the one religion which, on account of its exclusiveness and intolerance, was regarded by the tolerant pagans with disfavor and suspicion. But though it sometimes came into collision with the Roman authorities and some ill-advised attacks upon it were made, it was the constant policy of the emperors to let it alone and to protect the Jews against the hatred which their own fanaticism aroused. But while the Jewish religion was endured so long as it was confined to those who were born into it, the prospect of its dissemination raised a new question. Grave misgivings might arise in the mind of a ruler at seeing a creed spreading which was aggressively hostile to all the other creeds of the world, creeds which lived together in amity, and had earned for its adherents the reputation of being the enemies of the human race. Might not its expansion beyond the Israelites involve ultimately a danger to the empire? For its spirit was incompatible with the traditions and basis of Roman society. The Emperor Domitian seems to have seen the question in this light, and he took severe measures to hinder the proselytizing of Roman citizens. Some of those whom he struck may have been Christians, but if he was aware of the distinction, there was from his point of view no difference. Christianity resembled Judaism, from which it sprang, in intolerance and in hostility towards Roman society, but it differed by the fact that it made many proselytes while Judaism made few. Under Trajan, we find that the principle had been laid down that to be a Christian is an offense punishable by death. Henceforward, Christianity remained an illegal religion, but in practice the law was not applied rigorously or logically. The emperors desired, if possible, to extirpate Christianity without shedding blood. Trajan laid down that Christians were not to be sought out, that no anonymous charges were to be noticed, and that an informer who failed to make good his charge should be liable to be punished under the laws against calumny. Christians themselves recognized that this edict practically protected them. There were some executions in the 2nd century, not many that are well attested, and Christians courted the pain and glory of martyrdom. There is evidence to show that when they were arrested, their escape was often connived at. In general, the persecution of the Christians was rather provoked by the populace than desired by the authorities. The populace felt a horror of this mysterious Oriental sect, which openly hated all the gods and prayed for the destruction of the world. When floods, famines, and especially fires occurred, they were apt to be attributed to the black magic of the Christians. When anyone was accused of Christianity, he was required, as a means of testing the truth of the Church, to offer incense to the gods or to the statues of deified emperors. His compliance at once exonerated him. The objection of the Christians, they and the Jews were the only objectors, to the worship of the emperors was, in the eyes of the Romans, one of the most sinister signs that their religion was dangerous. The purpose of this worship was to symbolize the unity and solidarity of an empire which embraced so many peoples of different beliefs and different gods. Its intention was political, to promote union and loyalty, and it is not surprising that those who denounced it should be suspected of a disloyal spirit. But it must be noted that there was no necessity for any citizen to take part in this worship. No conformity was required from any inhabitants of the empire who were not serving the state as soldiers or civil functionaries. Thus the effect was to debar Christians from military and official careers. The apologies for Christianity, which appeared at this period, 2nd century, might have helped, if the emperors, to whom some of them were addressed, had read them, to confirm the view that it was a political danger. It would have been easy to read between the lines that if the Christians ever got the upper hand, they would not spare the cults of the state. The contemporary work of Tatian, A Discourse to the Greeks, reveals what the apologists more or less sought to disguise: invincible hatred towards the civilization in which they lived. Any reader of the Christian literature of the time could not fail to see that in a state where Christians had the power, there would be no tolerance of other religious practices. If the emperors made an exception to their tolerant policy in the case of Christianity, their purpose was to safeguard tolerance. In the 3rd century, the religion, though still forbidden, was quite openly tolerated. The Church organized itself without concealment. Ecclesiastical councils assembled without interference. There were some brief and local attempts at repression. There was only one grave persecution, begun by Decius A.D. 250 and continued by Valerian. In fact, throughout this century, there were not many victims, though afterwards the Christians invented a whole mythology of martyrdoms. Many cruelties were imputed to emperors unto whom we know that the Church enjoyed perfect peace. A long period of civil confusion, in which the empire seemed to be tottering to its fall, had been terminated by the Emperor Diocletian, who, by his radical administrative reforms, helped to preserve the Roman power in its integrity for another century. He desired to support his work of political consolidation by reviving the Roman spirit, and he attempted to infuse new life into the official religion. To this end, he determined to suppress the growing influence of the Christians, who, though a minority, were very numerous, and he organized a persecution. It was long, cruel, and bloody. It was the most wholehearted, general, and systematic effort to crush the forbidden faith. It was a failure. The Christians were now too numerous to be crushed. After the abdication of Diocletian, the emperors who reigned in different parts of the realm did not agree as to the expediency of his policy, and the persecution ended by edicts of toleration, A.D. 311 and 313. These documents have an interest for the history of religious liberty. The first, issued in the eastern provinces, ran as follows. We were particularly desirous of reclaiming into the way of reason and nature the deluded Christians, who had renounced the religion and ceremonies instituted by their fathers, and presumptuously despising the practice of antiquity, had invented extravagant laws and opinions according to the dictates of their fancy, and had collected a various society from the different provinces of our empire. The edicts which we have published to enforce the worship of the gods, having exposed many of the Christians to danger and distress, many having suffered death, and many more, who still persist in their impious folly, being left destitute of any public exercise of religion, we are disposed to extend to those unhappy men the effects of our wonted clemency. We permit them, therefore, freely to profess their private opinions, and to assemble in their conventicles without fear or molestation, provided always that they preserve a due respect to the established laws and government. The second, of which Constantine was the author, known as the Edict of Milan, was to a similar effect, and based toleration on the emperor's care for the peace and happiness of his subjects, and on the hope of appeasing the deity whose seat is in heaven. The relations between the Roman government and the Christians raised the general question of persecution and freedom of conscience. A state with no official religion, but perfectly tolerant of all creeds and cults, finds that a society had arisen in its midst, which is uncompromisingly hostile to all creeds but its own, and which, if it had the power, would suppress all but its own. The government, in self-defense, decides to check the dissemination of these subversive ideas, and makes the profession of that creed a crime, not on account of its particular tenets, but on account of the social consequences of those tenets. The members of the society cannot, without violating their consciences and incurring damnation, abandon their exclusive doctrine. The principle of freedom of conscience is asserted as superior to all obligations to the state, and the state, confronted by this new claim, is unable to admit it. Persecution is the result. Even from the standpoint of an orthodox and loyal pagan, the persecution of the Christians is indefensible, because blood was shed uselessly. In other words, it was a great mistake because it was unsuccessful, for persecution is a choice between two evils. The alternatives are violence, which no reasonable defender of persecution would deny to be an evil in itself, and the spread of dangerous opinions. The first is chosen simply to avoid the second, on the ground that the second is the greater evil. But if the persecution is not so devised and carried out as to accomplish its end, then you have two evils instead of one, and nothing can justify this. From their point of view, the emperors had good reason for regarding Christianity as dangerous and antisocial, but they should either have let it alone or taken systematic measures to destroy it. If at an early stage they had established a drastic and systematic inquisition, they may possibly have exterminated it. This at least would have been statesmanlike, but they had no conception of extreme measures, and they did not understand, they had no experience to guide them, the sort of problem they had to deal with. They hoped to succeed by intimidation. Their attempts at suppression were vacillating, fitful, and ridiculously ineffectual. The later persecutions of AD 250 and 303 had no prospect of success. It is particularly to be observed that no effort was made to suppress Christian literature. The higher problem whether persecution, even if it attains the desired end, is justifiable, was not considered. The struggle hinged on antagonism between the conscience of the individual and the authority and supposed interest of the state. It was the question which had been raised by Socrates, raised now on a wider platform in a more pressing and formidable shape. What is to happen when obedience to the law is inconsistent with obedience to an invisible master? Is it incumbent on the state to respect the conscience of the individual at all costs, or within what limits? The Christians did not attempt a solution. The general problem did not interest them. They claimed the right of freedom exclusively for themselves from a non-Christian government, and it is hardly going too far to suspect that they would have applauded the government if it had suppressed the Gnostic sects, whom they hated and calumniated. In any case, when a Christian state was established, they would completely forget the principle which they had invoked. The martyrs died for conscience, but not for liberty. Today, the greatest of the churches demands freedom of conscience in the modern states, which she does not control, but refuses to admit that, where she had the power, it would be incumbent on her to concede it. If we review the history of classical antiquity as a whole, we may almost say that freedom of thought was like the air men breathed. It was taken for granted, and nobody thought about it. If 7 or 8 thinkers at Athens were penalized for heterodoxy, in some and perhaps in most of these cases, heterodoxy was only a pretext. They do not invalidate the general facts that the advance of knowledge was not impeded by prejudice or science retarded by the weight of unscientific authority. The educated Greeks were tolerant because they were friends of reason and did not set up any authority to overrule reason. Opinions were not imposed except by argument. You were not expected to receive some kingdom of heaven like a little child, or to prostrate your intellect before an authority claiming to be infallible. But this liberty was not the result of a conscious policy or deliberate conviction, and therefore it was precarious. The problems of freedom of thought, religious liberty, toleration had not been forced upon society and were never seriously considered. When Christianity confronted the Roman government, no one saw that in the treatment of a small, obscure, and to pagan thinkers uninteresting or repugnant sect, a principle of the deepest social importance was involved. A long experience of the theory and practice of persecution was required to base securely the theory of freedom of thought. The lurid policy of coercion which the Christian Church adopted, and its consequences, would at last compel reason to wrestle with the problem and discover the justification of intellectual liberty. The spirit of the Greeks and Romans, alive in their works, would, after a long period of obscuration, again enlighten the world and aid in re-establishing the reign of reason, which they had carelessly enjoyed without assuring its foundations.